Late at night, the man discovered a seemingly harmless little girl in the room, never expecting she was a monster with a mouth full of sharp teeth. Soon, the sheriff and the coroner arrived to inspect the scene, by which time Dudley had already become a cold corpse. Yet, puzzlingly, no signs of a struggle were found at the scene, not even a single drop of blood anywhere around. Mills deduced that Dudley must have been alive just before death, and all the blood in the victim's body had been completely drained, a situation truly unheard of. Finally, Jim instructed the officers below to notify the deceased's family. The story shifts back one day earlier. Dudley ran an auto repair shop suffering poor business. To cut costs, he had no choice but to fire his employee Ham, immediately settling all wages owed. Clearly, this action left Ham resentful, who couldn't resist a parting insult at Dudley before leaving. That evening, Ham went to the bar where his girlfriend Jody worked and told her about being fired. At that moment, Ham's friend Nick got into a conflict with a customer, John. They started fighting over 2 women. Seeing this, Ham rushed to break it up, but was accidentally hit by John, making Ham furious. The bar owner promptly kicked Ham and Nick out. Jody, worried about Ham, followed them out. But the owner warned leaving without permission would mean docked pay. Result? Jody defiantly smashed a bottle over the owner's head and fired the boss on the spot. Only after calming down did they start regretting it. Now, jobless and with no savings, their income stream was completely cut off. Now they couldn't even afford to pay the rent. As they stared at each other helplessly, the landlord arrived to collect rent. With no choice, Ham quietly slipped away with Jody. Meanwhile, John successfully picked up the 2 women. On his way home, he stopped for gas, coincidentally at Dudley's repair shop. Now, Dudley had to pump the gas himself. Suddenly, he noticed the lights inside flickering abnormally, so he put down the nozzle and hurried to check. At that moment, the 2 women said they needed the restroom, leaving John alone waiting in the truck. But the next second... Meanwhile, Dudley entered the building to check things out, and then... homeless. Ham took Jody intending to move to another town. Despite the grim situation, Ham remained optimistic about the future. But Jody doused his enthusiasm, pointing out they now struggled for basic survival. This led to a major argument, causing them to crash the car. When they woke up, the sun was already high. Luckily, they were only dizzy and otherwise unharmed. Getting out, they found bloodstains on the front bumper and a scrap of fabric resembling clothing. Looking around, they saw no one else. Then, Jody noticed a road sign indicating a mobile home park ahead. They guessed the person hit might have gone there. Upon arrival, however, they found it was just a derelict, dilapidated park, seemingly deserted. They decided to get out and search on foot. Suddenly, a man carrying a shotgun emerged, telling them to leave immediately. Jody explained they were only looking for someone hit by their car, but Crawford refused to listen, insisting they leave quickly. Ham, however, acted unpredictably. Before leaving, he asked Crawford where they might find work. Surprisingly, Crawford said he actually had some available. They then followed Crawford back to his house, where he warned them never to go out at night and assigned them a bedroom. After asking, they learned everything here originally belonged to his brother-in-law, Madison. They planned to turn it into a trailer park, providing a space for traveling tourists. He named the whole place Bogieville. Crawford added that Madison had a virtuous and beautiful wife, and they lived very happily. At this point, his expression suddenly turned sorrowful. When Crawford snapped back, he reiterated the warning: never go out at night, and absolutely never let anyone inside the house. Crawford's final warning to Ham was that the attic and basement were off limits, no entry allowed. Seeing Crawford's stern and frightening gaze, Ham quickly nodded in agreement. Crawford then took Ham outside to look around. Seeing the rundown place, Ham wondered what job Crawford had for him. Suddenly spotting a pile of bones on the ground, Ham panicked instantly, demanding to know what happened. Crawford remained silent, opening the door to one of the trailers. The terrified Ham nearly wet his pants, declaring this place wasn't for him and wanting to take Jody and leave immediately. But Crawford said it was too late. The vampire inside had already caught his scent. No matter where Ham fled, the vampire would follow him. Crawford added that Madison had also become a vampire and was currently locked in the basement.
Go on. For an old man, you got a hell of a sense of humor.
Crawford told Ham if he didn't believe it, He could wait until dark, when the truth would reveal itself. At that moment, Ham had a question.
How come you're not one of them?
Medicine let me live, as long as I took care of the place. Made sure no one poked around while they rest.
Ham still wanted to leave after hearing this, but Crawford advised him staying here would be safer. With no choice, Ham could only return to the room. Then, he told Jody the whole story from beginning to end. But Jody just wanted to catch up on sleep at that moment, completely disbelieving Ham's words. Meanwhile, Crawford went up to the attic calling his daughter Lily's name. And Lily was the little girl who killed Dudley. Crawford told Lily he had found 2 reliable people, so if he passed away someday, they could take over his job. He then told Lily to stay in the basement with her uncle and aunt. Soon after, Crawford left the attic and happened to run into Ham and Jody. Seeing Crawford's tear-reddened eyes, they didn't dare ask more questions. Crawford also didn't tell them about Lily's existence. Time came to night. Ham quietly went to the attic door, curiously trying to listen for any sounds inside. Unexpectedly, he was caught by Crawford right then. Crawford immediately warned Ham he must follow the rules and ordered him to go back to sleep. Meanwhile, Nick was attempting to strike up conversations with a girl when he spotted Lily alone and kindly approached to ask if she needed any help.
Hey.
By the next day, Jim had learned about Nick being attacked. Surprisingly, Nick was still alive and currently receiving treatment in the hospital. Jim racked his brain trying to figure out who the killer was, but Mills seemed to have a wild guess in her mind. She thought the killer could be a vampire because Dudley was killed by having his blood drained, and Nick survived only because he was carrying a cross. Jim laughed out loud upon hearing this guess. He thought Mills was making an international joke. He simply didn't believe vampires existed in this world. But Mills believed there seemed to be more than one vampire. Although Jim didn't believe it, the case still needed investigating. So, he found the bar owner asking about Nick. The owner mentioned Nick had an argument with John not long ago, and Ham was also involved in their fight. And Ham's former boss was Dudley, so Jim locked onto Ham as the target. At that moment, after careful consideration, Ham and Jody ultimately decided to leave this place. But before leaving, Ham wanted to look at Madison in the basement, though obviously Crawford wouldn't agree to their request. So, Ham picked up the shotgun from the table and pointed it at Crawford, threatening him to take them to see the basement. With no choice, Crawford could only satisfy their curiosity. The moment the basement door opened, a foul smell hit them, making them almost throw up the next day's dinner. As soon as Ham entered, Madison grabbed him by the throat and pinned him against the wall. Lily learned Ham and Jody were the people Crawford had found, so she didn't harm them. Madison roared at them, ordering them to obey commands from now on and take good care of Bogieville. Meanwhile, Jim and Mills came to Nick's hospital bed. From him, they learned his attacker wasn't human. Though it had the form of a little girl, she had fangs and looked like a walking dead person. This made Mills even more certain of her guess. She was convinced the attacker was a vampire, but Jim still disagreed with Mills's judgment. At the same time, Ham and Jody safely came out of the basement. They were very curious about what happened to Madison and the other 2. It turned out that over 20 years ago, Madison's wife and Lily went to the storage shed to get something. They happened to see a woman with fangs sucking the blood from a small dog. Madison, hearing the screams, rushed to the shed, but was unfortunately bitten on the neck by the woman. Madison staggered painfully outside the shed. Yet when sunlight hit the woman, sparks immediately burst from her body, and in an instant, she was burned to ashes. Crawford at the time didn't know the woman was a vampire, thinking she was just a lunatic, so he hurried back inside to get a first aid kit to disinfect Madison's wound. But when he returned to the shed, he saw Lily with white eyes and bloody teeth, and Tess was the same. Then Madison walked over. He remained clear-headed and could communicate normally with Crawford, telling him to get away from them quickly. Soon after, Madison, Tess, and Lily went to the nearby town, attacking people like rabid dogs. The vampire group eventually grew larger and larger. Once turned into a vampire, their appearance froze at that moment. They never aged. Like Lily, over 20 years later, she was still a little girl, but her actual age was over 30. Crawford stated he was advanced in years. After his death, Ham needed to stay here to protect Lily. That night, Crawford took Ham and Jody outside to introduce them to the other vampires. After all, the responsibility of guarding this place would soon be handed over to them. However, the other vampires were very eager to taste Ham and Jody's blood when they saw them. Madison told them all to restrain themselves, explaining that they couldn't survive during the day and needed humans to protect them. Unexpectedly, all the vampires were very displeased. They stated that becoming this way was entirely his doing. Everything was because Madison bit them, and even Tess and Lily felt the same. Several of the vampires, unconvinced, broke away from their group and chose to survive elsewhere on their own. Back inside the house, Ham remained unsettled for a long time. He simply couldn't accept the existence of vampires. Crawford warned Ham that these vampires had an intense craving for blood, and if not replenished in time, they would become extremely vicious. However, there were benefits to becoming a vampire, not only eternal youth, but also the ability to cure incurable diseases. Lily was originally blind, but now her senses were heightened 1,000-fold, and her vision was clearer than that of a normal human. The next day, Jim and Mills discussed the recent bizarre cases. Mills still held firm to her views, but unexpectedly faced ridicule from every officer present, who all agreed Mills was talking nonsense. Afterwards, the police continued with their work. Jim stated that the case details must remain confidential to avoid causing unnecessary panic. At night, Nick in the hospital bed suddenly grew tense. It was John, turned into a vampire, coming for revenge, and he specifically brought the two girls for Nick to see one last time before pushing him straight out the window. Meanwhile, Ham was patrolling in the woods when he suddenly spotted a vampire under a car. It was one of those who had left the group the previous night. Unable to endure the torment of the sun, it begged Ham to pull it out from under the car, but the next second, its body instantly caught fire, and it turned to ash. Ham hurried back into the house and told Jody they needed to leave this place immediately. He couldn't stand dealing with vampires anymore. But Jody countered that if they ran, they would likely end up becoming vampires themselves, so Ham decided to sneak back to town first to see if he could find another solution. That night, Madison discovered Ham had fled Bogieville and flew into a rage, grabbing Crawford by the neck and shouting that the person he found was completely unreliable. Elsewhere, Ham arrived at the bar and learned that Nick had been injured and hospitalized. He rushed over, but by the time he arrived, Nick was already a corpse. Based on Mills's analysis, Nick's death didn't look like suicide, as the wounds showed signs of being inflicted by a sharp weapon, indicating a very ruthless killer. Finding no escape plan, Ham ultimately returned to Bogieville. Crawford, seeing this, immediately shot out the car tires to prevent Ham from fleeing again. Late that night, several vampires got into another internal conflict. Crawford, trying to mediate, was unfortunately cut across a major artery by a knife and ultimately died from excessive blood loss. Ham and Jody, hiding nearby, immediately ran up to check. Lily looked at her father's body, heartbroken. The next day, Ham dealt with Crawford's body, but the thought of escaping resurfaced. He told Jody to stay put while he went back to town again to seek the police's help. Ham found a long, unused car in a warehouse and, using his professional skills, quickly repaired it. When Madison discovered Ham had left Bogieville, he swiftly found Jody to confront her. Jody was so frightened she fell straight onto the ground. She then quickly got up and opened the curtains. Madison, unable to endure the burning, had to leave, allowing Jody to narrowly escape. Meanwhile, Ham found Jim and told them everything. The police finally believed in the existence of vampires. So Jim found the pastor and had a cross distributed to every officer. Led by Ham, the police soon arrived at the trailer park. Jim stood in the center and shouted loudly, declaring they would burn all the vampires. They then opened the door of one trailer and fired multiple shots at the vampire inside. The vampire fell to the ground and, exposed to sunlight, instantly burned to ash. The three people in the basement heard the commotion outside. Madison grabbed a light-blocking tarp, abandoned his wife and Lily, and chose to flee alone. The remaining Tess and Lily then got into a conflict themselves. In a rage, Lily pushed Tess out the door. When the police reached the basement, they found it empty, so they went to a warehouse to search for any vampires who had escaped. The police quickly eliminated most of the vampires, yet Madison remained nowhere to be found. Ham swore he had to find and eliminate him, otherwise he'd spend the rest of his life living in fear. Just then, Jody spotted the light-blocking tarp on the ground.
Stand down!
After bullets pierced several holes in the tarp, sparks instantly flew up. The police assumed Madison must be dead, so they didn't pursue further. Sadly, Jody ultimately didn't make it, and became one of the vampires. 3 months passed quickly and Ham chose to stay and live in Bogieville. That day, Jim drove to Bogieville. They had eliminated all the vampires but hadn't seen Jody anywhere. As it turned out, Ham was keeping Jody on the other side of the warehouse. A car sped down the road. Unexpectedly, Madison was still alive. And that was the entire plot of the 2025 American horror film, Bogieville. All right, that's all for today's share. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.